welcome everyone. Come on, make your way in. I'll just get started. I'm Allison Voglesong Zejnati. I'm an EPP, BEC, and Con Eco major here. And today I'll be talking about the progress and process of cleaning up Great Lakes areas of concern. And I'd like to start by introducing the background of my project with a brief video from the year 1987 from the Canadian Broadcasting Company. It's only 2 minutes.
The United States and Canada have signed a new agreement on pollution in the Great Lakes. 2/3 of Canadians and millions of Americans get their water from the Great Lakes system. A water quality agreement has been in place for the past 9 years, but now the two countries have agreed to do more, and environmentalists are hoping that they follow through. Ian Hannah-Mansing reports.
The Great Lakes system is the biggest reservoir of fresh water in the world. Almost 40 million people get their drinking water from the lakes and rivers in the system. But that water is laced with more than 1,000 chemicals. Many of them are toxic.
We've got those same chemicals in our fish, in the drinking water, and likely in human tissues. So we're looking at an overly contaminated Great Lakes system.
Today in Toledo, Ohio, the Canadian and American governments signed an agreement to clean up the Great Lakes. There have been agreements before, but critics say governments didn't have the will to follow through. Environment Minister Tom McMillan says this one is different.
It's not the Holy Grail, but it's a darn good instrument for action.
Some of the key elements of the agreement include widening the scope of pollution studies so that more emphasis will be placed on airborne pollutants and contaminated river and lake beds. They'll try to find out how to clean up 42 hotspots, areas in the Great Lakes where pollution is at a critical level. There'll be a timetable for government action, and there'll also be more public input. Environmentalists helped draft this agreement, and they'll be involved in the implementation. A member of a coalition of more than 200 environmental groups says their involvement may make the difference.
There are so many citizens groups working out there now who are pressuring the government to follow through on their promises. That's where my hope lies.
Despite their enthusiasm, environmental groups say today is simply a fresh starting point. There are dozens of studies and reviews of pollution that need to be done. And then provincial, state, and federal governments may decide what legislation they want. Even if the spirit of today's agreement continues, the environmentalists say it could be years before any significant cleanup of the Great Lakes gets underway. Ian Hannah.
All right, so as the video noted, public input was a key innovation of this cleanup process. And the mechanism for this input became what are known as Public Advisory Councils, or PACs. And these are where the public, industry, academia, public interest groups, and local governments all came together to advise on the implementation. As the video also noted, this handshake agreement was just the beginning, point A. So to get to point B, having cleaner Great Lakes waters, it would take time and planning and implementation. And the expectation was for this implementation to be relatively straightforward. So our Area of Concern program provides us with a natural experiment of collaborative community-based implementation that spans over the course of 30 years. And from the vantage point of 2019, we can look back at the past 3 decades and learn lessons from the reality of implementation, which is much more messy, like spaghetti. So my overarching question of interest is, why do areas of concern differ in the progress they've made in remedial actions? And there are more than 40 areas of concern in the Great Lakes, and Michigan has 14 of these sites. By the numbers, progress varies and overall is quite slow. For example, in Michigan, only 2 of these sites have completed cleanup to date. So in order to answer this overarching question, my research question looks to the experiences of these participants on these public advisory councils in order to understand from their perspective what factors enable and constrain their ability to navigate the messy spaghetti of implementation. I selected 5 case study sites: the Kalamazoo River, the Lower Menominee River, the Saginaw River and Bay, the St. Clair River, and White Lake. And I've selected them as a set, so collectively they express the variety that exists in all of Michigan's areas of concern. So both large and small geographic scope, urban and rural communities, just a few environmental problems, some have many, as well as the variety of progress. So for example, White Lake has completed their cleanup, whereas other areas of concern have a long way to go still. And I met with 29 past and present participants of these public advisory councils and conducted semi-structured interviews with them. I asked them questions, and I also had them help me draw what was their concept of this spaghetti mess of the implementation process. And so I asked them about factors that come from beyond the scope of their group. So external factors like the context of the community, the capacity of the community, as well as the actions and actors at the state and federal level. I also asked them to identify factors that are internal to their group, so its origin, structure, and function, the way it is managed and has its own process, as well as the participants' attitudes and their perceptions about the process. And in their interviews, PAC members identified more than 60 of these enabling and constraining factors. And so I'd like to highlight a few that I find particularly interesting and surprising. One enabling factor is something we've actually already heard about today, this strong community identification with the water resource. As one person put it, our community culture is tied to the water. It's part of the social fabric of where we live. And this is enabling because it enables community buy-in for the remediation. So where people care about and see themselves in the water, they want to see it cleaned up. However, one constraining factor is that there are different levels of understanding about the environmental problem. One member noted there's these urban legends about what the contamination is in their community. And so while they might have buy-in for the remediation, this can undermine some of that buy-in if there's a lack or difference of understanding. So for example, this is the river walk on the St. Clair River, and people love it. But community members have complained that the weeds are too tall and they can't see over them. So there's different understanding of the environmental services natural shorelines provide. Another interesting factor is that there are other remedial actions occurring outside the area of concern program at the local, state, and federal level. And so the remediation is happening externally to the program, and this program is piggybacking off of the progress. For example, in the 70s and 80s, municipal water systems upgraded under the Clean Water Act. And so while water quality benefits accrued in these communities, it wasn't something that the area of concern program was doing per se. Now, this factor itself can also constrain progress because the PACs don't have a connection to these outside programs. For example, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, also operates in some of these areas of concern where there's hazardous contamination. But this process is driven by litigation. And so these groups don't have a seat at the table, and they don't have a connection to ownership over or power when it comes to these other external remedial programs. When I asked the participants about the capacity of their community, in every single case study, people noted that it's motivated and engaged individuals that make the difference for progress. There's stalwart advocates who are vying for improvement, and often they noted these were well-connected people in their community. So interestingly, only a few of the case study sites mentioned that they had benefited from private sector engagement, where their industrial actors were willing to step up, be innovative, and take on the actions needed to do the cleanup. And this was obviously beneficial because there was investment into the remedial actions. Most cases, however, PAC members noted that there was a lack of this investment or engagement from the private sector. They just weren't willing to make the investment or show up at the table. And in these cases, if the cleanup did happen, it would often be through these other regulatory programs that required the cleanup. And again, the PAC members did not have a connection to those processes. And this pattern was similar when it came to the local government engagement. Local governments were not really there, but where they were, it was absolutely beneficial to progress because they could bring staff, they could bring technical capacity. They had the land that they could actually do something with. And so this was an extremely important part of the progress, but it was much less common. And PAC members noted that local governments weren't preventing cleanup per se, they were just turning a blind eye to it. And so this was very constraining, but PAC members also recognized local governments were operating under austerity, so they didn't necessarily have the resources to bring to the table. And when it comes to the state and federal agency actors, I'm showing this kind of silly GIF because I think it's really emblematic of this common image that the governments are made of money. Okay, so this guy's made of money, right? The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative brings in $300 million annually to the Great Lakes for cleanup efforts. And this concept is also that the money's what's driving the boat. It's driving the priorities. And forgive the terrible pun, but the money's invested in the water, so to speak. But there's this focus on bucket-ready, shovel-ready projects. And the more serious point to make here is that the funding really helped to get progress going. It helped to be consistent and flexible to support remedial actions. And it's also helpful because it goes to these advisory groups themselves. So it funds staff, technical capacity, and contributes to their outreach and education initiatives. And again, the key is that it has continuity. So they can have a more stable organizational capacity as they're operating. Now, it's also important to note the timeline here because this program started, if you could tell from the big glasses, it was in 1987, right? And so the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative didn't come online until the mid-2000s. So that's 20 years where there was either no funding or inconsistent funding, and that was a major constraint to the progress. And they also noted that not only was there not money to put in the water, but the groups didn't have funding. Some of them became semi-dormant. Other ones just spent time fighting with each other, arguing, placing blame, focusing on the problems because there wasn't money to focus on the solutions. And that was a major constraint. What also constrained these groups was a lack of clear criteria. So when the program started, there were these purported problems, and the first step was to go out and identify, verify where are the problems. But then these groups were left on their own to set a target for criteria. How would they know when the problem was solved? Oops, too soon. So the timeline again, in 2006, after 20 years, finally the Michigan agency, the Office of the Great Lakes, set clear criteria and standards that defined how clean is clean enough. And now, while the groups don't always agree with where the state agency drew the line and saying this is when the problem is solved, it was enabling because for private companies, private sector, it enabled certainty. So as before, they weren't going to sign on to something where they were going to endlessly spend money on a problem that may never be solved. Having criteria gave them a clear endpoint and allowed them to have more certainty, and then they were more interested in buying in to participating. So when the Area of Concern program started, the public input was on paper. And in the first early years, only 1 out of 4 areas of concern, Great Lakes Basin-wide, had these groups. And oftentimes these groups were steering committees that the state had hand-selected. So understandably, these communities weren't exactly trusting of public advisory organized by the state agency. And so the bottom-up origins of groups that decided to self-organize became much more trusted groups because the community members saw themselves in these groups and they were more trusting of the group to hold the government accountable in the process. And while the groups were self-organized and independent, this means that they also had very different structure and different membership. And the challenge became defining the membership. Who gets to have a say, who gets to be in, who's not at the table. And today this is still a challenge for many of these groups because they don't necessarily have a clear definition of membership. They might not have resolved that problem. And so on one hand, you need these processes to be open, right? Anybody who's interested in helping to solve the problem should have a seat at the table. But as one member said, you can't just have someone show up to a meeting one day and then change the course of what they've been working on for 30 years. So this is still an unresolved problem in some places. And while these groups are 501c3 organizations sometimes, other groups sometimes are just people that meet and they don't have like a legal status. But common among all of them is that they have a board of directors. And so one factor that's enabling their progress is when they have committed and engaged board of directors. These volunteers that show up, they're answering emails, they're communicating with each other, they understand each other better, and this provides a stable foundation for these advisory groups. However, these groups also face challenges because their boards are volunteers, and so sometimes there's inconsistent engagement or inconsistent communication. They don't get paid to work together, so it makes it easy to skip a meeting, not read a report, and this slows down the decision-making process. If they don't have a quorum at their meeting, then they can't vote to make a decision, and this is a challenge. And making a decision itself can be its own thing, because sometimes there are many different, often opposing interests that are around the table. So PAC said that strong leadership was an absolute key for enabling progress. And they said that it takes a champion, right, with a passion to see things get done, to carry the process forward. But notice they didn't say to see things get done their way. So what's important about having an effective leader is that they're cultivating respect of the process, that everyone feels like their voice can be heard. So there's rules that are fair, that everyone feels they have a say in what's going on, and that's what makes an effective leader. This is much easier said than done, and we've all been in poorly managed meetings. As you know, they hinder progress. They can go off the rails, you get too far in the weeds. Sometimes misunderstandings can foment conflict that doesn't get resolved, or people just don't feel like their voice is being heard or respected. And so one PAC member said that this is more than anything a missed opportunity. There's talent around the table, but they're wasting their time and they're not taking advantage of the assets they do have in their group. One thing that I think is really amazing about these advisory councils is that some members have been involved since 1987, continuously. And this is a boon because it enables these groups to have institutional memory. They know where they've been, the mistakes they've made in the past perhaps, and where they're going. And so the experience factor can really enable the progress they're making. On the other hand, in the 80s, no one thought they were signing up for a lifetime appointment. Members in subsequent years, they've retired. Maybe their one single problem got solved, and so they don't have an interest anymore. Frankly, some members also died. And so the issue with membership attrition is that these groups are dwindling down. It's hard to keep these things going for a long time. So they have a small group, and they don't necessarily have a good recruitment strategy for replacing members that leave or lost. They also feel limited by when the state has certain control over certain steps in the process. So the big banner here is it's bureaucracy. And oftentimes after these groups give their input into the process, it's in the hands of state and federal bureaucracy, which means it's a lot of waiting. 30 years of on and off waiting can be a challenge. And similarly, participants expressed discouragement. Oh, did I get ahead of myself? Yeah, okay, so similarly, they've expressed discouragement. People, and I didn't hear this just once, I heard this many times over. They didn't think that they would live to see the day that this process would be complete and that their area would be cleaned up. But there is hope, and the people who have stayed on for so long are motivated by this holistic vision. So they're really interested at the ecosystem scale. They don't have their one issue that they're interested in. They're looking at the big picture. And success itself is motivating. So when they do get that win, when they do clean something up, it's really rewarding. It makes it worth the wait. It makes it worth the time. And so recognizing these accomplishments adds value for these participants to stay involved in the process. Taking a step back, what is the answer to this overarching question? Why do these areas of concern differ in their progress? So I'd like to use an analogy. We used to think that the solution to pollution was dilution, right? That our problems would just take care of themselves. And the reason this program got started was because we kind of found out that's not really how this works, right? We have to have a process for taking care of the pollution. But then we turned around and kind of made the same mistake when it came to these advisory groups. We set up a community-based collaborative initiative, and then we expected it to take care of itself. So when it comes to what we've learned from the past 30 years of the Area of Concern program, it's that we need to tend to the process of collaboration and tend to it continuously, cultivate it like you would a garden. So where we find that there's progress, we find not just the presence or absence of these factors, like that the group has control, there's clear roles, that the groups are well balanced, it's not just one group or the other, but that they're keeping track of these things. And as the situation changes, they're checking to see, do they still have what they need? Do they still have clear criteria? Do they still have support for public outreach initiatives? If they've lost an effective leader, they're paying attention throughout the process and attending to the process of collaboration. And that's where you see effectiveness in these public advisory councils, and that's where you see progress. And so for the Michigan Office of the Great Lakes that manages this Area of Concern program, I've made some detailed recommendations that would bore you quite a lot if I went into the weeds there. But along all these factors, what is it that the Area of Concern program can do to help tend to these factors as things go on? So I'd like to leave everyone here in C's with just a more general recommendation. And you may find yourself either convening or participating in a similar community-based collaborative process. And so I recommend never expecting a straight line. Come in with the expectation and manage the expectation of others that there will be spaghetti. There will be a messy implementation process, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back. But if you tend to the process, if you pay attention to the different parts of it, if you make adjustments when there's changes, you might just have a reality that's a little less messy and hopefully an environment that's much more clean. Thank you very much. I'd really like to thank my advisors, Paul Steelbach, Julia Wandelich, John Allen from the Office of the Great Lakes, who brought this project opportunity to us here at C's, as well as all of the folks in the Office of the Great Lakes. Rick Hoverla is here. He's the program manager at the Area of Concern program in the Office of the Great Lakes. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't really have time to dive into a lot, but one of my findings was that groups that seem to have more effectiveness have individuals that have network connections, not only to just their social networks as individuals. Often these are people who, if they're serving these groups in a organizational or professional capacity, and they have connections to inter-organizational networks, so even if it's a friend there, or maybe it's a professional connection at these other institutions in the region, that seems to be where there is more effectiveness, because they can either do things like bring in those other capacities, so funding, institutional support, even folks who know people in these other programs, right? Some people said that it was easier for them to just work through their personal connections at the other federal and state agencies than it was to work through their point person in the state. So yeah, that's very intuitive. It's absolutely one of the findings that I found. Right.
Where does the 300 million go? I guess I'm just wondering, seems like a lot of money, but then I could see remediation costs a lot of money, but only 2 of the 14 have been remediated, and they get 300 million every year. And I guess I'm just wondering if the PACs aren't funded at all, and we're not funding people to really be invested in the social side of it, then I would imagine all the money's going to the cleanup and stuff like that. But is that the case, or do you think that there's maybe regulatory glut that could be trimmed to help fund some of the social engagement and incentivize people to be continuing on with this?
Absolutely. So a couple parts there. And in the interest of time, I sort of glossed over. So the $300 million annually, that's a congressional appropriation. If you see Great Lakes news every year, especially now, Trump cuts it and then Congress says, no, don't take our money away. So that's $300 million for the whole Great Lakes Basin, and it's split across 4 programs. And so the areas of concern and chemicals of mutual concern are one of these program areas. So it's not all $300 million going only to Michigan. I guess I was a little misleading there. And then so a portion of that funding goes to the state. And so Michigan has PAC support grants. And so that's how they support some of these advisory groups with funding some limited number of what they're doing, like staff, technical things, outreach initiatives. But as you're absolutely right, the need for supporting these groups is much greater than the available funding that's there. And so some groups are able to sort of cobble together other grant resources, other funding to make their group a little bit more robust. But sometimes that means that they have to take a step away from the advisory area of concern program, because now they got money from Section 319 and they're working on a watershed plan. And an interesting point to make here is that these groups aren't necessarily coming every day because they want to delist this area of concern, right? They're interested in cleaning up the environment and where they live. And so, yeah, they're interested in pursuing other funding, but sometimes it takes away from the focus of this specific thing. But that's okay with them because they're still making their environment cleaner. So absolutely, one of my recommendations to the State Office of the Great Lakes is to appropriate state funding, so there's no state budget that goes to these advisory groups. And so I suggest that using state budget could help to fill the gaps and help boost the organizational capacity of these groups where they still need it. Did that get all your?
Yeah, that was more than.
Okay, yeah, out of time.
Those questions.
Yeah.
Again, you can ask more questions after this is over, but we're going to my next